Hi, everyone. I've got my notes on my laptop here. Great to see so many people here. My talk is going to be an attempt to look here we go, at the recent history of urban thinking and urban planning, which has attempted to reimagine the urban form, or more specifically the city, through identifying and analyzing emerging mega-urban areas. And in particular, what I want to do is look at the concept of megalopolis, introduced in 1957 by John Gottman, and then more recent ideas of the megaregion, seen here in a map from the Regional Plan Association in 2008. What I'm going to do is a critical comparison between these two moments in mega-urban thinking and planning, and along the way introduce some new work in urban theory on planetary urbanization, which can, I'm going to argue, help us make sense of the complexity, scale, and interconnection of contemporary urbanization processes, maybe more adequately than either the idea of megalopolis or the megaregion. I want to begin by briefly motivating the talk via a key tension in the field of urban studies today, which I'm going to illustrate with a little Greek mythology. So this is the bed of Procrustes. In the myth, Procrustes would tell travelers passing by his house that he had a magical bed which would accommodate itself to any sleeper, regardless of their size. But actually, there was no magic. If you were shorter than the bed, he'd stretch you out using a rack. And if you were taller than the bed, he'd lop off your extremities with an axe. And that's what we see going on here. So it's a gruesome tale, right? But it's also, I think, a great metaphor for things that initially seem more flexible than they turn out to be. And I think we've got this kind of problem with our unit of analysis in urban studies, and I'm referring to the city. So beginning with the new urban sociology of Lefebvre, Castells, and Harvey, a major meta-theme of the last 4 decades of urban theory has been the radically increasing complexity, scope, and ubiquity of the urban condition. And yet, despite these theoretical innovations, in methodological terms, contemporary urban studies almost always takes the city, or some other similar conception of the urban, as a spatially bounded site to be its unit of analysis, placed into comparison with other spatially bounded city sites. I call this tendency methodological cityism, the use of the concept of the city as an analytical lens for understanding processes of urban transformation which are not limited to the city. In other words, a focus on the city as a site as opposed to urbanization as a process. Now, methodological cityism isn't inherently a problem, right? If the phenomenon under investigation is limited to the city, so the impact of urban heat island effects on city residents, or maybe the relationship between housing prices and municipal voting behaviors, those kinds of things, then taking the city as the unit of analysis is perfectly sensible. But my contention is that these cases are a lot rarer than the prevalence of methodological cityism would lead us to believe. So, in the spirit of transcending methodological cityism, I'm going to look at, as I said before, the recent history of urban thinking and urban planning, which has attempted to go beyond the city. And I'm going to use the binational Great Lakes region as the historical foil for doing this. Along the way, I'm also going to say a little bit about the maybe now forgotten relationship between the Great Lakes megalopolis and the first UN Habitat Conference, which, as we know, occurred 40 years ago right here in Vancouver. So, to start with, this is a map of the Great Lakes megalopolis made by the Greek planner and architect Konstantinos Doxiadis in the context of his visionary plan for the urban Detroit region, which he drafted in the late 1960s. And this is a region that stretches from Chicago all the way up to Quebec City. It's a binational area, and the population currently of this area is around 50 million people. Now, Doxiadis got the concept of megalopolis from the geographer and political scientist John Gottman, although the term was previously coined by Patrick Geddes and used frequently by Geddes' student Lewis Mumford to describe the phenomenon of cities grown out of control. In Mumford's words, not in fact a new sort of city, but an anti-city. Now, in Gottman's more precise usage, megalopolis referred to a specific geographic formation, the northeast seaboard of the United States, from Boston up in the top down to Washington, D.C., and even further to the south. And Gottman was a lot more optimistic than Mumford, calling megalopolis a completely new pattern of living and of regional interdependence between communities. One of the things that Gottman stressed about megalopolis was the importance of what he called a hinge function, not a temporal one like John was talking about, but a spatial one, a hinge function between national and international economic space. Megalopolis, in Gottman's idea, was a phenomenon both of urbanization and of globalization. Now, Doxiadis came to the concept of the Great Lakes megalopolis when he was commissioned in 1965 by Con Edison, the power company, to do a study of the future growth of Detroit for infrastructure planning purposes. Now, Doxiadis defined as his study area what he called the urban Detroit area, which is the red zone here, with a diameter of 300 kilometers, compared in contrast to the Con Ed service area, which is the area in black, which already was much larger than the city of Detroit. So he bid off this enormous area to carry out this study. And he actually used an early UNIVAC computer system to algorithmically identify and then evaluate 49 million different scenarios for possible growth and development in the region, which, to my knowledge, was at the time the most ambitious use of information technology which had ever been carried out in urban planning. Now, the projections and plans that Doxiadis used for the urban Detroit area, they weren't just spatially and technologically ambitious, but temporally ambitious as well. So here's a series of land use projections for the chosen developmental alternative, which is algorithm identified. So starting from 1965, the present, when the study was done, carrying out to 2000, when there's a new urban growth pole in the Detroit region, and there's a kind of more or less continuous urban fabric, all the way through to the year 2100, when the region was projected to have more than 100 million occupants. But actually, the urban Detroit area was only the smallest of 4 distinct scales at which Doxiadis' analysis of Detroit was carried out. So the smallest scale was the urban Detroit area, but he also analyzed what he called the Great Lakes megalopolis, shown in red here, and then eventually the entire continent of North America in order to inform his planning and projections for Detroit. The reason for this was that Doxiadis believed that the steadily expanding historical scale and scope of human action increases the scale of the urban beyond the traditional idea of the city. And this idea persistently drove him to push his planning theory and practice beyond city boundaries. And in the case of the Detroit urban area, led him to this concept of the Great Lakes megalopolis. Now, a few years later, in 1975, Doxiadis' World Society for Acoustics partnered with Barney Danson, who was the Canadian Minister of State for Urban Affairs, to organize the Great Lakes Megalopolis Symposium in Toronto in March 75. The proceedings were published the following year in the volume shown here, and the participants in this symposium included Doxiadis, John Gottman, Marshall McLuhan, Margaret Mead, Buckminster Fuller, and various other luminaries. And from my own selfish perspective as a professor in the School of Urban Planning at McGill, I can note that Gene Wolfe, who ran the school for many years, was also one of the participants here. And the goal of this conference was to define the Great Lakes megalopolis in theoretical planning and governance terms, to serve as a starting point for federal urban planning by the Canadian government, from the Ministry of State, to stimulate binational cooperation between Canada and the US over the region's development, and then finally to form a Canadian submission to the Habitat Conference happening in Vancouver the following year. Now, the key challenge identified by the symposium was the question of coordinating service and infrastructure provision in an equitable fashion over a large and rapidly urbanizing area. And in this regard, the Great Lakes Megalopolis Conference echoed U.S. Senator Clarence Pell's efforts from the previous decade to improve transportation service and infrastructure policy in the Northeast U.S. megalopolis from the previous decade. The concept here was characteristically Fordist Keynesian in the sense that it aimed at a production of integrated and egalitarian national economic space. And this also fit really well with the aims of the Habitat Conference, which was also a conference organized very strongly along national lines in terms of national urban developmental strategies. So the Great Lakes Megalopolis Symposium, in addition to carving out a kind of distinct policy agenda around the region, also attempted to lay the groundwork for a more comparative and transposable policy discourse around megalopolises. So Gottman and Doxiadis both proposed applying the megalopolis concept extensively around the world to characterize existing regions, but also emerging or potentially emerging urban regions. And this modularization of the concept of megalopolis was intended, again, to inform the Habitat meeting to provide an agenda for the rest of the world. Now, in the end, the impact of the symposium on Habitat 1 was fairly modest. So there's one paragraph made it into the Vancouver 1976 declaration here, but no specifics were established beyond that. And actually, the whole idea of megalopolis by the mid-70s was really waning in importance, thanks to mainly to the crisis of Fordism, because the urban challenges both in the Great Lakes region and throughout the global north following the mid-70s were often more challenges of decline in managing crisis than they were about continued growth. So now I want to do a brief comparison between this initial generation of the megalopolis with contemporary policy discourse on megaregions. And I'm thinking particularly here in the North American context of the 11 megaregions defined by the Regional Plan Association, shown here in their 2008 map. Now, a key statement of the new discourse on megaregions can be found in Catherine Ross's book, Megaregions, Planning for Global Competitiveness. And this book reflects an emerging planning and policy common sense that, in Richard Florida's terms, megaregions are coming to relate to the global economy in much the same way that metropolitan regions relate to national economies. So what is the new form of relationship between megaregions and the global economy that they're identifying? We can see a clue in the subtitle of the Ross book, but here are some more hints taken from some recent megaregional policy initiatives in the US. So first we have in Florida, Connecting for Global Competitiveness. And then in Kentucky, the Bluegrass Economic Advancement Movement is a super region that can compete on a global scale. And here's one from Southeast Louisiana describing the global competitiveness of the New Orleans Baton Rouge region. And then finally, the global gateway strategy of the Southwest megaregion. What these all have in common is a focus above all on global competitiveness. So in contrast to the concern for redistributive service provision, which characterized the policy discourse around megalopolis in the 60s and 70s, overwhelmingly contemporary megaregion discourse is focused on increasing the economic competitiveness of these gigantic urban spaces. And one interesting example from my research is in Arizona, where local governments have attempted to use the idea of an Arizona megaregion to brand their region as a kind of new global city, placed in this case in comparison with Beijing and Jeddah. In fact, I would argue that the concern for global competitiveness is so strong here that the megaregion isn't so much an actually existing urban form in the North American context as it is a speculative entrepreneurial development strategy. So to summarize these differences here, we can first of all say that megalopolis had a kind of prototypical significance in the sense that it was thought to herald a new urban form arriving, whereas the megaregion has attained something more like a stereotypical form. If we think about the regional plan map, almost all of American urban space is divided up into one of these megaregions. But at the same time, both the megalopolis and the megaregion have a characteristic of basically an upscaled city. They're a form of settlement space that's larger than the one that came before, but with a similar kind of characteristics of a bounded space on a map. Meanwhile, in substantive terms, both megalopolis and megaregion have been thought of in terms of the relationship with globalization. So in the previous case, in terms of service provision, and the more recent case of megaregions in terms of global competitiveness. And then finally, whereas the kind of national regulatory framework of Fordist Keynesianism, which underlied the megalopolis, has given way to a more characteristically neoliberal global policy framework for megaregions, where national governments are no longer assumed to be the key actors. Okay, so to conclude here, what I want to do is give a few brief thoughts about ways we can improve on both of these approaches to urbanization, which focus on defining new, larger urban territories. I'm thinking here about recent work on planetary urbanization. So to begin with, Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt have recently argued that urbanization is constituted by moments of concentration, so agglomeration, urban growth, and the rest of the processes we normally associate with the city. And secondly, extension, the development and mobilization of hinterlands and resource extraction frontiers that support urban growth. And then finally, differentiation, the restless creative destruction and uneven development of urban landscapes. And related to this work, I've made the argument that the city or any bounded settlement space is an increasingly inadequate tool for grappling with this complexity and corresponds more closely to an ideology or a representation of urban processes. So the reason I bring up this new theory about planetary urbanization is because there's an assumption of both megalopolis and megaregion planning discourses that these regions are consolidating in governance terms. And the reality I found is the opposite, that there's actually been a proliferation of different governance arrangements at all sorts of different spatial scales and covering all sorts of different overlapping and sometimes inconsistent territories. So if we look at the Great Lakes in the present moment, the closest thing we see to actually existing mega-regionalism is the Council of Great Lakes Governors. It's a binational group, but they have no urban agenda, actually. It's mainly about waterway issues. And arguably, waterway issues are urban issues, whether or not we think of them that way right now, because increasingly urban growth is coming up against environmental constraints, which require us to widen our conceptual lens when we think about urbanization. Meanwhile, there's another recently formed group, a coalition of chambers of commerce in the region, which collaborate on economic development, but again cover a completely different geography from the Council of Great Lakes Governors, don't cross the Canadian border. And then so what this proliferation to me suggests is that attempts to define and characterize bounded urban spaces, whether cities, megalopolises, or megaregions, are doomed to failure, at least to insufficiency. The Great Lakes megalopolis or megaregion isn't a new, larger urban form supplanting the city. It's a set of complexly articulated political, economic, and social spaces, many of which exceed the territorial scope even of the enormous megaregion. So what we need, I'm saying, are concepts and ultimately governance tools that move fluidly between scales and territories. And it seems to me that the ideas of concentration, extension, and differentiation from planetary urbanization are a promising start. Thank you.